I will now pour gluten into my liquid to drink it. There goes the gluten. Oh man. It's not enjoyable gluten, we'll just put it that way. Just a couple of weeks ago, I recorded an entire video about how those with celiac disease should not eat any gluten, even just a little bit of gluten, because even just a little bit of gluten can still damage your intestine and give you terrible symptoms. And I still stand behind that. And just a couple of weeks after I filmed that video, I actually purposely consumed gluten 3 days in a row. And it wasn't just like a really small amount, it was a decent amount of gluten. Am I a liar? Am I a hypocrite? I'm not a liar. I'm not a hypocrite. Really only 2 reasons that those with celiac disease should ever eat gluten. Maybe 3 if for some reason you have to eat gluten to save the world, although I never see that happening. So one acceptable reason to eat gluten with celiac disease is when you're trying to get diagnosed with celiac disease, because when you're not consuming gluten, the manifestations of celiac disease aren't as present, and therefore you can't get diagnosed or it's harder to get diagnosed. So you need to be eating gluten when you're getting diagnosed with celiac disease. The only other time that those with celiac disease would eat gluten is while they're participating in a clinical trial for a drug to treat celiac disease, and that is why I purposely consumed gluten 3 days in a row, was for a clinical trial. Now, not all drugs to treat celiac disease that are currently in clinical trials require that the participants consume gluten. It just depends on how the drug works and is designed to treat the symptoms of celiac disease. I know that for those who've had celiac disease for a very long time, they've heard over and over again that there'll be a cure eventually. Well, we're getting closer, according to the experts in the celiac disease field. If you go to the Beyond Celiac website, you can see that there are 13 drugs either in clinical trials or soon to be in clinical trials to help treat those with celiac disease. None of these drugs that are in clinical trials now are a complete cure for celiac disease. We're still working in that direction. But if these drugs that are currently in clinical trials are approved for use by the public, these drugs will work in tandem with the gluten-free diet and reduce the symptoms that people with celiac disease continue to experience even when they're following a strict gluten-free diet. I personally still have symptoms every day, even though I'm eating gluten-free. If we are going to get to a cure for celiac disease, we need you, and yes, I mean you, those of you watching this YouTube video who are human and have celiac disease, we need you to go out and participate in clinical trials so that we can find a flippin' cure for celiac disease, because it's about time. I will tell you about my experience of participating in a clinical trial and consuming gluten, but first want to walk briefly through what are the different phases of clinical trials and then what are some of the drugs in the clinical trial pipeline that we're seeing progress. So Beyond Celiac put together this cool infographic that shows what the different phases of clinical trials include. In phase 1, that's the first time the drug is ever tested in humans, and the main purpose of that phase is to make sure that the drug is safe, to understand what the drug does to the body, and then see what side effects, if any, there are when people consume that drug. In phase 2, now we're also looking at how well does the drug work, and we're also seeing how much of the drug should be administered to people, what is the dosage. And then in phase 3, we're still looking at, is the drug safe? We're also continuing to look at how well does the drug work, but now we're looking at, do the benefits of the drug outweigh the risks? After drugs make it through phase 3, they can apply to be approved by the United States Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, and then be made available to the public. The FDA may even continue to monitor the drug after it's been made available to the public in phase 4, and just continue to make sure it's safe and look at the long-term side effects of the drug. So we had a pretty robust process for making sure that these drugs are safe. And actually, of the 13 drugs that are currently in clinical trials to treat celiac disease, we have drugs in all of the different phases and even before phase 1. So you may be thinking, 13 drugs, that's a pretty good deal. That's a lot. It sounds like we're gonna have some good options, but not all the drugs that begin clinical trials make it all the way to FDA approval. In fact, Beyond Celiac's website shows that there are already 4 drugs that have withdrawn from the clinical trial phase because they weren't successful. Also, these drugs can be in clinical trials for a long time. According to Kristen Neff, who happens to be a vice president in the drug company of the drug for which I participated in the clinical trial for, she also has lots of experience in the clinical trial field. She said that a drug can take up to 8 years from development to approval by the FDA, which is a pretty long time. And the longest interval of time is always the enrollment period, getting people to sign up and participate in clinical trials. So the more people that participate in clinical trials, the quicker we can get to approved drugs to treat celiac disease. And as I said before, not all clinical trials require gluten consumption. And I know not everyone is willing to participate in a clinical trial that requires gluten consumption because some people have really terrible symptoms. If I had really terrible symptoms when I consumed gluten, I would not have been willing to consume gluten as part of that clinical trial. There are a few different ways that drugs can help treat symptoms for celiac disease and eventually lead to a complete cure. Some drugs actually work on just breaking down the gluten with an enzyme. Some drugs focus specifically on the effects of gluten on the cells lining the intestine. One of these drugs, which I think you pronounce larazotide acetate or larabartide acetate, falls into this category. Normally, the cells that line your intestines are kind of like tightly knit together with no gaps in between them. When you have celiac disease, those junctions between the cells can kind of get loose because of the damage to your intestines from eating gluten. Then gluten gets through those junctions into places where gluten shouldn't be, and that triggers further immune response. So this drug, larazotide acetate, works on strengthening the junctions between those cells and pulls them together so that gluten can't get to where it's not supposed to be, therefore reducing your immune response. It's kind of like those strongman competitions where you have those really big buff guys that are holding these 2 columns that weigh 5,000 pounds each, preventing them from separating. And I bring up the drug larazotide because it's currently in a phase 3 clinical trial and has shown success at reducing symptoms. So we got some hope coming out of that drug. There are drugs that focus on preventing the TGG enzyme from modifying gluten. This is important because when people with celiac disease consume gluten, the TGG enzyme actually modifies gluten so that it fits better on the certain cell that then goes and shows gluten to other cells that then induces the immune response. By preventing this TGG enzyme from modifying gluten, it can't fit as well on this cell, and then that reduces the immune response. Some drugs are meant to induce immune tolerance, which means these drugs are basically training your immune system to just not respond to gluten at all, which, if developed more, is how we're going to cure celiac disease. Because if this works, you can consume gluten and then these drugs make it so that your body doesn't respond at all. Currently though, the drugs that are attempting to induce immune tolerance to gluten are still meant to be used in tandem with the gluten-free diet because we're just not quite to the phase where it's going to be a complete cure yet. So the clinical trial that I was in was one of these drugs that is attempting to induce immune tolerance against gluten, and that's why I consume gluten as part of the clinical trial. If you have a drug that's supposed to turn off the immune response to gluten, you need to consume gluten to see if the drug works. That's just science. Lastly, there's a group of drugs that are attempting to interrupt the immune response when gluten is consumed. I may actually be participating in another clinical trial for a drug that falls into this category. So this drug actually binds to this protein that causes inflammation, therefore reducing that protein's ability to cause inflammation and therefore improving symptoms of those with celiac disease. It's kind of like when a toddler comes and just like grabs onto your leg and then you can't do anything because you have a toddler on your leg. Or it's kind of like if you're my wife and you have an annoying husband that likes to just grab onto you to prevent you from doing things for no reason. I mean,
what are you doing?
Holding you so you can't do anything. Kind of like that. So why should you participate in clinical trials for celiac disease? Well, number one, that'll help us get to a cure faster, and that will not only benefit you, that'll benefit your family that may have celiac disease, that'll benefit future generations so that we can have more healthy lives. You may be able to spend less money on food. You'll be able to do things like go to parties and eat all the food. And some clinical trials do compensate you for participating to make it even more worth your time. So I participated in a phase phase 1 clinical trial for a drug called KAN-101 that, as I said, is attempting to induce immune tolerance and just stop the immune system reacting completely when you consume gluten. So when I was participating in the clinical trial, I received the drug first over a period of 2 weeks, and then I consumed gluten 3 days in a row. And no, I didn't get to eat any gluten I wanted to. I couldn't just eat Oreos or Pop-Tarts or deep fried Oreos and Pop-Tarts, which would have been amazing. They gave me an exact amount of gluten in powder form to drink in water. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to share with you the symptoms I had from consuming gluten. And no, I didn't actually decide that after I consumed the gluten. I made that decision before. The purpose of this phase was not to see whether or not the drug worked, but was just to see how safe the drug was. So if I had told you that I consumed gluten and then didn't feel anything after I consumed gluten, which would make it seem like the drug is working, well, yes, the drug could have been working, or they could have given me a way higher dose than what they would actually be giving to people. Or if I did consume gluten and did feel symptoms, well, that could mean that the drug isn't working, or it could mean that I didn't receive a high enough dose for the drug to be effective, or I could have received a placebo and therefore didn't actually receive any drug at all. So it's just really not fair for me to say how I reacted to consuming gluten, because that could bias you, the viewers, of wanting to or not wanting to participate in a clinical trial going forward, and I don't want to do that. Here's just a little demo of what it was like to consume gluten. I will show you that. They gave me this awesome free brochure that tells me how to consume gluten, and they even gave me this free tote bag with gluten in it. Isn't that great? Don't you all want to participate in clinical trials now? Okay, we're gonna put some water in the bottle, 100 milliliters of water. So we just, that's 100 mils. Okay, and we take this packet of gluten. This is literally a packet of gluten. Tap the gluten packet against a hard surface and allow contents to settle to the bottom of the packet. I will now pour gluten into my liquid to drink it. There goes the gluten. So we put the lid on, and then we're supposed to shake it like a Polaroid picture for 30 seconds. And I might not actually go that long. So I did do this yesterday at the clinic, and this tastes like malto-meal. After I shake it, I'm supposed to drink it and then keep swirling it between each sip like it's fine wine, even though I don't actually drink wine. Oh man. It's very frothy. Yeah, it tastes like malto-meal. It doesn't taste that good. I just want to get all this froth out. Gluten likes to stay in and doesn't want to come out. So now that I've drinking this initially, I actually have to put more water in here and rinse it out so I get more of the gluten in me. So I'm just gonna add some more. Shake it like a Polaroid picture, round 2. Drink the gluten, round 2. Not as frothy this time, but still tastes like malto-meal. It's not enjoyable gluten, we'll just put it that way. I'm gonna go put some more water in this. Shake it like a Polaroid picture, 3rd time. We just gotta make sure we get as much gluten in my system as possible. It's very important. And after this, I don't have to drink gluten again today. Oh man, it just feels so wrong to do this. And we're gonna call that a wrap. In case you're wondering what type of gluten this is everybody's favorite. You can see right there it says vital wheat gluten. That's right, everyone's favorite. It also says not for commercial use, so sorry I can't sell this to you. Hope you enjoyed that. So what I want you to take away from this video is that if you're willing and able to participate in a clinical trial, you should, so that we can get a cure for celiac disease, because it's about flipping time. In the description, I'm going to link to resources where you can learn more about clinical trials and where you can sign up to participate in clinical trials near you. Peace.